It was supposed to be a routine shoot, just a simple interview with a well-known sports journalist. I had done this 100 times before. I've worked as a cameraman for one of the major TV stations for nearly a decade now. And though the job can be stressful, it's not often something genuinely strange happens. But that night, I'll never forget it. We were in the middle of setting up in a quiet, dimly lit studio on the outskirts of the city. The journalist, Paul Davis, had just arrived and was going through some notes with the host, Jessica. The lights were set, the microphones were working, and everything seemed perfect. I checked the monitors one last time, the cameras were rolling, and the red recording light blinked softly in the corner of the room. Then the lights began to flicker. It wasn't a big deal at first. We've had power issues before, especially in this old building. I figured it was just a surge or a loose connection, so I called over to Steve, the sound guy, to make sure everything was still running. He gave me a thumbs up and signaled that the audio was fine. But the flickering didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. And with each pulse of light, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. At first, it was subtle, just a chill creeping through the air. Then it became impossible to ignore. My breath turned into a thin mist as I exhaled. Jessica glanced over at me, her face pale. "Is the heating off?" she asked, rubbing her arms. I shook my head, too focused on the lights to reply. Something felt wrong. I could sense it in my gut. The air had this weight to it, like the atmosphere was being pulled taut, ready to snap. Suddenly, the cameras cut out. Every single monitor went black. Steve cursed under his breath, and Paul looked around, confused. "Did we lose power?" Paul asked, though it was clear the lights were still on, albeit barely. I rushed over to the control panel, my hands shaking slightly. "No," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. "The power's still running, but the cameras." Before I could finish, a strange sound filled the room. A faint crackling, like static from an old radio, but more distant, more deliberate. I scanned the room, trying to find the source, and that's when I noticed it. Steve's radio, the one we used to communicate with the control room, had turned on by itself. It was hissing softly, the dials turning on their own. The voice that came through the radio chilled me to the bone. "Cold, isn't it?" The voice was distorted, crackling with static, but it sounded disturbingly familiar, like someone I knew but couldn't place. Everyone froze. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see Paul, Jessica, and Steve shivering uncontrollably. I was no different. Felt like the cold was seeping into my bones. Who's there?" Steve stammered, his eyes glued to the radio. The voice on the other end chuckled, low and menacing. "I'm here, all around you." My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer to the radio. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was only static. Then, the voice responded, and I swear it sounded exactly like me. "I want what you are." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. This was no prank, no glitch. Something was in the room with us, something not human. I've heard stories about haunted studios and cursed buildings before, but I never gave them much thought. Ghosts, poltergeists, spirits, they were all just tales to me. But standing there, staring at that radio, I realized this was different. This was real. Jessica screamed as the lights dimmed completely. The studio plunged into darkness, save for the weak glow from Steve's radio. It felt like the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My fingers were numb, and I could barely move. Then, in the flickering light, I saw someone, standing in the corner of the studio. A shadow, indistinct but human-like. It was watching us. "I'm cold." The voice echoed again from the radio. But this time, it wasn't just the radio. The words seemed to come from the shadow itself. I turned towards Steve, who was still gripping his equipment like a lifeline. "Turn it off," I shouted, motioning to the radio. "I can't," he yelled back, frantically twisting the knobs. "It's not responding." The figure in the corner began to move, slowly stepping closer. I could barely make out its features in the dim light, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. It looked just like Steve. "That's impossible," I whispered to myself. The shadow mimicked Steve's every movement, like some grotesque copy, except its form was blurred, like a reflection in water. Paul stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cables, his face pale with terror. What is that?" The copy of Steve tilted its head, mirroring his own gesture, but something about its movements was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. "I'm cold," it repeated again, this time with Steve's exact voice. I grabbed the nearest piece of equipment, a microphone stand, and held it in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice wavered. The shadow stopped, hovering just inches away from Steve, its form shifting and flickering like a dying light. Then it spoke again, this time with my voice. "Who will I be next?" The lights flickered once more, then shut off completely. We were plunged into absolute darkness. The only sound the faint hiss of the radio and the ragged breathing of everyone in the room. But something else was breathing too, something cold. The darkness closed in on us, thick and suffocating. I could still hear the faint static from the radio and the labored breathing of my colleagues. But beyond that, there was a deeper sound, a slow, deliberate inhale, followed by a rasping exhale. It was coming from all directions, but I knew that wasn't possible. Whatever was in that room wasn't everywhere, but it sure as hell felt like it was. "Who are you?" Paul's voice broke the silence, but it trembled. The shadow, the thing that looked like Steve, shifted in the darkness. It was hard to tell, but I could feel its presence moving, gliding toward Paul now. My feet felt frozen to the ground, as though the cold had seeped into my bones and taken root. "Who will I be next?" the thing repeated. But this time it wasn't Steve's voice. It was Paul's. I could see the horror in Paul's eyes, the dawning realization that this thing was copying him. His voice, his movements, his essence. Slowly, as if the creature had decided to toy with us, its shape shifted. The blurry edges of its form became clearer, sharper. The shadow peeled away, and there stood Paul, an identical replica down to the way he was gripping his notes. "No," Paul whispered, backing away. "No, this isn't happening." But it was, and I had no idea how to stop it. Suddenly, the air became even colder. My breath froze in front of me, hanging like a small cloud. The creature's presence was overwhelming now. I could feel its gaze shifting between all of us, as though it was deciding who it would copy next. The radio crackled once again, and the static deepened into a garbled voice. "I was once like you," the voice whispered through the radio, distorted and broken. "Living, breathing. Now I am so much more." I was shaking now, gripping the microphone stand like it was a lifeline. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. The radio hissed again. "To be, to exist." The replica of Paul tilted its head, then smiled, a grotesque, distorted version of a human smile. "You all give me form," Steve finally snapped, grabbing a chair and hurling it toward the creature. But the chair went straight through, clattering uselessly on the floor. The shadow rippled for a moment, then reformed, its expression unchanged. "Violence won't help," the voice mocked, this time using Steve's voice again. "I am beyond it now." I could feel panic setting in. My heart was racing, my mind spinning for a way out, but nothing made sense. This thing, it wasn't just a ghost, wasn't just an apparition. It was feeding off us, off our presence, mimicking us with an eerie accuracy. And the cold, it was worse every second, biting into my skin like needles. Suddenly, the flickering lights came back on. Dim at first, then stronger. The figure, the one that had just copied Paul, seemed to dissolve under the light, its edges blurring and fading. But before I could feel any sense of relief, the radios crackled violently, louder this time, spitting static that hurt my ears. "It's not gone," Steve shouted. "It's still here." And then the most chilling thing of all happened. A voice came through the radio again, but it wasn't distorted anymore. It was my voice. "I will be you next." I felt a strange, invisible weight press down on me, like someone or something had latched onto my very being. My breath hitched, and I could feel something pulling at the edges of my mind, trying to pry its way in. My vision blurred, the studio around me warping and twisting. "Fight it!" I heard Jessica shout, her voice distant, as though it were coming from underwater. But how could I fight something that had no form? Something that was everywhere and nowhere all at once? The weight in my mind grew heavier. My thoughts slowed. My limbs felt like they were turning to stone. I could sense the creature, its cold, calculating presence trying to slip into me, trying to mimic me like it had done with Steve and Paul. "I'm not," I muttered, trying to hold onto my thoughts, my sense of self. "I'm not you." The lights flickered again, and in that moment, I felt a sharp jolt, like something had snapped. My vision cleared, the crushing weight lifted from my mind, and I gasped, stumbling backward. The cold presence, the thing that had been trying to take me, suddenly recoiled, its form flickering and distorting like a broken reflection. I realized then that the creature, whatever it was, couldn't fully mimic us unless it broke us down first. It needed our fear, our confusion, our helplessness. Jessica rushed over to me, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, still struggling to catch my breath. "But it's trying to copy us. To be us." Paul, still shaken, backed toward the exit. "We need to leave. Now." But as we turned toward the door, the creature, no longer in any form but a shadow, slid across the floor, cutting off our exit. The radio crackled again. "You can't leave." We froze, staring at the shadow that now blocked our only way out. Panic surged through me, and I looked at my colleagues. Steve was shaking uncontrollably. Paul was muttering something under his breath, and Jessica was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. The shadow expanded, rising up, filling the room with its cold presence. It was like the air itself became heavy, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. "I can't let you leave," the voice said, now cold and emotionless. "I need you." The room felt like a tomb. We were trapped not by walls but by this thing that could copy our very being. "We can't let it take us," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "We have to fight it." But how do you fight something that has no body? Something that can copy your every move, your every thought? Then the lights flickered once more, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way in, before it became one of us. The question wasn't whether we could stop it. It was how long we had before it succeeded. And if it did, would anyone ever know the difference? The air was so thick with cold that it felt like we were breathing ice. The shadow loomed before us, blocking the exit, shifting and writhing like it was alive. I could feel it probing at the edges of my thoughts again, searching for a way in, but I held on tightly to my sense of self. I couldn't let it take me. Steve was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does it want with us? Why us?" It wants to be us, I replied, my voice trembling. It needs us to exist. Paul stepped forward, his back straightening as if he'd made a decision. We can't fight it, but maybe we can trick it. I looked at him, confused. What are you talking about? Paul glanced around the room, his eyes falling on the equipment, the cameras, the microphones, and most importantly, the old radio that had been crackling with the creature's voice. It's been using the radio to communicate with us, right? Maybe it needs the equipment to maintain its presence here. What if we cut the power? Everything. Lights, cameras, the radio. If we kill the tech, maybe it'll weaken. Jessica looked skeptical. But the radio, it turned on by itself. The lights too. Paul nodded. I know, but if we shut everything off manually, we might force it to let go. At least long enough for us to get out. It was a gamble, but at that point, we didn't have many options. The shadow was growing larger, more defined, and it was shifting between forms. One moment it looked like Steve, the next it was mimicking Paul. Each time it copied one of us, it got closer, more solid. Do it, I said, my voice steadying. Shut everything down. Steve, still trembling, managed to nod. He rushed to the main control panel, his fingers fumbling as he grabbed the master power switch. Jessica and I backed up slowly, trying to keep the creature's attention. His focus was wavering, flickering between us like it couldn't decide who to copy next. The radio crackled violently, the static growing louder, as if the creature knew what we were trying to do. You can't escape me, the voice hissed, now using Jessica's voice, perfectly mimicked. I will find you. I will be you. But just as the voice reached a fever pitch, Steve yanked the switch. Everything went dark. The lights cut out, the cameras powered down, and the radio fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing in the blackness. The cold remained, but the oppressive presence, the shadow, seemed to lose its grip. I could feel it retreating, pulling back like a tide. Now, Paul shouted. Go! I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the door, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest as we stumbled through the darkened hallways, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs. The cold still clung to me, but it was weakening. We burst out of the studio and into the crisp night air. The difference was immediate. The biting chill of the creature was gone, replaced by the normal autumn cold. I collapsed against the side of the building, gasping for breath, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. Jessica was trembling beside me, her hands gripping her knees. Did we make it? Paul looked back toward the studio, his face pale but resolute. I think so. Still in there. We cut it off from the equipment. Steve wiped the sweat from his brow. What do we do now? We can't just leave it there, right? I shook my head. We don't have a choice. That thing, it's tied to the building. It needs the technology to manifest, and we shut it down. But who knows how long that will last? The truth was we couldn't stay. We had survived, but the creature was still in there, lurking, waiting. We had managed to escape its grasp, but it wasn't defeated. Not really. Paul stood up straighter, his expression hardening. We'll report the equipment failure, say the building's unsafe. They'll shut it down for a while, maybe even tear it down. But whatever's in there, it's stuck now. I could only nod. There was no way we could explain what had really happened. No one would believe us. Ghosts that could copy your very soul, that used radios and cameras to manifest. It sounded insane. But we knew the truth. That thing was still in there, waiting for the next group of people to come along, the next flicker of power to give it life again. We left the building that night, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment. The cameras, the lights, the radios, they were all still there, untouched. But none of us wanted to go back. Ever. As we walked away, I glanced back at the darkened studio one last time. The windows were black, the power completely dead. But in the silence of the night, I could almost hear a faint crackling of static. The creature wasn't gone. It was just waiting. A few months later, the station decided to shut down the studio for good. No one ever gave a real explanation for why the equipment was left behind or why the building was sealed off, but there were rumors. Some said it was haunted, others said it was cursed. But we knew the truth. We never spoke about it again, not even to each other. But every time I pass by that area, I feel the cold, just for a moment, and I swear I can hear my own voice echoing back from somewhere inside. Whatever it was, it's still there, still waiting for someone to turn on a light, plug in a camera, or flip a radio dial. And when they do, it will become them, just like it almost became me.